Something about this Cleveland situation has been bothering me for weeks, and I finally have to say it out loud. Not because I want to stir controversy, not because I'm looking for a reaction, but because what's being reported and what's actually happening inside that building are so far apart that staying quiet feels like its own kind of dishonesty. I went back through everything: the press conference transcripts, the raw footage, the specific words Todd Monken used when he faced those reporters. I tracked the sequence of events across those 3 days of voluntary minicamp with the kind of attention I'd normally reserve for playoff film. And what I found wasn't just sloppy reporting, it was a pattern. A consistent, directional pattern of choosing which facts survive the edit and which ones quietly disappear. And once you see it, you genuinely cannot unsee it. Let me build this from the ground up, because the foundation changes everything. The Browns held a 3-day voluntary veteran minicamp in April. 3 days. Voluntary, no pads, no live pass rush, no defensive backs physically disrupting routes through press coverage, no stakes attached to a single snap that hit that field. When a franchise installs a new head coach, the NFL creates this specific window for a reason. It is an orientation period. The coaching staff installs language, builds a shared communication framework, and begins establishing how they think and operate. That is it. That is the entire purpose. Not evaluation, not competition, orientation. Todd Monken stood in front of reporters after those sessions and communicated exactly that, with complete clarity. He called what he'd seen a 40,000-foot view. He was essentially drawing a boundary in plain language. Don't project onto this. Don't manufacture conclusions. We are at the very beginning of something. And then, almost immediately, the coverage did the exact opposite of what he asked. Within hours of that press conference, the narrative had already been assembled and shipped. Deshaun Watson had seized control. He looked commanding. He looked like a veteran who owned the room. Shedeur Sanders, by contrast, was described as falling behind, struggling to keep pace with a more experienced presence. And then one outlet went somewhere that I still find genuinely staggering. They floated the idea that Shedeur might not even hold the backup spot. Third string. On a depth chart. After 72 hours of helmets and shorts, walk-through sessions, in a voluntary spring practice with no competitive conditions anywhere on the field. That idea entered the conversation, and then repetition did what repetition always does in sports media. It borrowed credibility from volume. People who hadn't formed a view yet heard the claim enough times that it began to feel like established fact, like something serious analysts had already settled among themselves. But here's what actually came out of Monken's mouth at that press conference, not the version that fit the pre-built story, the actual substance of what he said. He confirmed that the practice script gave Shedeur more total repetitions across all 3 days. He explained that certain practice periods were built around run game installation, and that run-heavy windows naturally compress meaningful quarterback snaps regardless of who's taking them, which created a visual impression of imbalance that didn't reflect the actual distribution of quarterback work. And then he said this: Shedeur took the first reps in 11-on-11 team drills. He said the rotation would rotate from session to session, and that no competitive conclusion should be drawn from how a single day was sequenced. The head coach of the Cleveland Browns, on record, publicly, told that room that Shedeur Sanders went first in team drills. And the story that came out of the exact same press conference was Watson asserting veteran dominance while Shedeur struggled to find his footing. That is not a matter of different analytical interpretations reaching different conclusions from the same evidence. That is a deliberate choice about which facts get carried forward and which ones are left behind. And I don't think that choice was accidental. Now let me take you somewhere that didn't get nearly the attention it deserved: Miami. During the early part of the offseason, before any of this minicamp noise existed, Shedeur was down there doing private work. The unglamorous kind. Early mornings, footwork, route timing, the repetition that either happens or it doesn't, based entirely on personal discipline, because no one is filming it and no one is giving grades. A content creator found him, a streamer who wanted footage of Shedeur throwing routes, shareable content, the kind that travels fast online and builds positive momentum for a young player who, frankly, needed every favorable story he could get right now. And Shedeur said no, not with attitude, not dismissively, with a quiet directness that told me more about who this young man is than anything I've seen on a football field. He said, in effect, "When you see a ball in my hands, understand what it means. Minicamp is coming. Training camp is coming. I have a job to earn and a competition to prepare for that I cannot afford to take lightly for a single day. Come back when that's finished. I want you to actually sit with what that cost him in that moment, because it cost something real." Shedeur Sanders is competing against a quarterback who is owed $46 million by the same organization writing both their paychecks. $46 million that doesn't move, doesn't shift, doesn't get adjusted based on what happens in a training camp depth chart battle. That financial commitment creates a kind of organizational gravity that I don't think gets discussed honestly or often enough. It generates institutional pressure, quiet, structural, persistent pressure, to find a way to make that investment look justified, to arrange the story so the money feels defensible, even when what's happening on the actual field is pointing in a completely different direction. Shedeur lives inside that gravitational pull every day. And in the middle of an off-season where visibility and positive narrative momentum genuinely matter, his answer is to send the camera away and go back to his footwork drills. That is what real competitive seriousness looks like when nobody is keeping score. Josh Cribbs said something that deserved a completely different level of engagement than it received, and I've been frustrated about the way it was covered ever since. First, you have to actually understand who Josh Cribbs is within this specific conversation, not a television voice-filling airtime, not someone generating controversy for platform traffic, one of the most genuinely respected figures in the modern history of Cleveland Browns football. A man who gave that city everything, physically, emotionally, across the complete arc of his career, and earned the kind of standing with real Cleveland fans that doesn't fade because it was never manufactured in the first place. When someone with that credibility says uncomfortable things about the direction of the franchise he loves, you engage with what they said at the level it deserves. You don't flatten it into a hot take and move on. What Cribbs said was specific and serious. He wants Shedeur Sanders to get a real evaluation, not a managed one. Not an evaluation where the organizational conclusion has already been quietly shaped in the background by financial considerations that have nothing to do with football performance. A genuine evaluation built on competitive evidence gathered under real conditions. Conditions that Shedeur's entire first professional season never once actually provided. And when you look honestly at what that first season was, calling it difficult is an understatement that borders on dishonest. Shedeur played inside a franchise in structural collapse, an offensive line that couldn't protect him with any consistency, a receiver room that was incomplete in ways that made his job measurably harder on nearly every single snap. And across 7 starts inside that broken environment, he performed at a level that earned Pro Bowl recognition, not a sympathy gesture, not a name recognition vote, but a deliberate collective judgment from players and coaches who watch professional football for a living, that what they were seeing from a rookie operating under those conditions was genuinely exceptional. And still, the coverage positions him as the question mark, the one with the complications, the one whose last name is a distraction. Meanwhile, Deshaun Watson, nearly 2 full years away from meaningful NFL football, carrying 2 Achilles ruptures on the same leg, with one of the most complicated recent histories at the quarterback position in the entire league, gets framed as the misunderstood veteran whose best football is simply waiting for the right system to release it. Look at that contrast directly. Then ask yourself honestly whose interests that framing serves. The Baker Mayfield reference that Cribbs dropped landed the way it was designed to land. He didn't bring that name up casually. He brought it loaded with everything that name carries specifically in Cleveland. All the weight, all the unresolved pain, all the difficult honesty of watching a franchise lose patience with a quarterback before it ever gave him the environment he needed to show them what he actually was. Mayfield was pushed out. The narrative curdled. Organizational patience ran out. And then he went to a place that believed in him, and he won a Super Bowl. Cribbs was asking Cleveland a question with the precision of someone who has watched this movie before and recognized the opening scenes. Are you about to run this same sequence again? Are you going to let $46 million in sunk cost, the institutional need to justify the most expensive organizational decision in franchise history, the repeated confident declarations formed before any real evidence existed? Are you going to let all of that quietly determine an outcome before the actual competition has even been allowed to happen? That is not a rhetorical question designed for engagement. That is the question that defines what Cleveland builds from this exact moment forward. I want to engage with the financial argument seriously because on the surface, it actually sounds logical. The $46 million is committed regardless of what happens on a depth chart. The money leaves the organization whether Watson is QB1 or inactive on game day. So the case gets made. If you're paying him that amount no matter what, why not give him every competitive opportunity to justify it? I understand the arithmetic. I genuinely do. But here is what that argument keeps refusing to honestly account for. Every snap Watson takes in training camp, in preseason, in a regular season start, that is a snap Shedeur Sanders does not take. And quarterback development does not work like a financial instrument you can pause and redeem later at full value. A quarterback develops through specific repetitions accumulated under specific competitive pressure with specific coaching attention applied at a specific point in his development curve. That window is real, and it is not permanent. The actual cost of organizing this competition around a contract rather than around football merit is not visible on any budget line. It shows up in the developmental trajectory of the quarterback who is supposed to represent what this franchise becomes next. That cost doesn't appear on any spreadsheet, which is probably the precise reason it keeps getting overlooked by the voices most comfortable when their analysis can be expressed in numbers someone can point to. There is a football question sitting underneath all of this that has received almost no serious analytical attention, and I find that neglect genuinely baffling. Todd Monken built one of the most dynamic, efficient offenses in the entire NFL in Baltimore. The structural foundation of everything he constructed there was Lamar Jackson, one of the most singular athletic weapons the quarterback position has ever produced, a player whose legs fundamentally reorganized every defensive calculation on every play. Now look at who is competing for the starting job in Cleveland. Shedeur Sanders is a pocket quarterback. His entire game is built on timing, precision, structural accuracy, rapid processing of coverage, and clean delivery inside a system designed specifically around those qualities. Watson, at his operational peak in Houston, was a dual-threat quarterback whose most valuable plays required his mobility to change the down-by-down mathematics of the game in ways a pure pocket passer simply cannot replicate. If Monken is building an offense in Cleveland centered on pocket efficiency, timing, and system accuracy, and his entire offensive history strongly suggests that is exactly what he does when he has a genuine pocket passer available to him, then the honest football question is whether Sanders is actually the more natural schematic fit for what this staff is trying to construct. That question is not getting the serious treatment it deserves. And I think the reason it isn't is that answering it honestly complicates the narrative that has already been built, packaged, and sold to the audience. The thing Cribbs said that went almost completely unnoticed in the coverage is actually, in my reading, the most important observation made about this entire situation. He talked about the new stadium coming to Cleveland, a genuine structural inflection point for the franchise. A moment where, with the Watson chapter beginning its slow movement into franchise history, the Browns have a real opportunity to walk into a new building carrying a new identity, a new face at the most important position on the field, and a new story that reflects what is actually being built rather than what already came apart. A new stadium deserves a story that has real weight, real texture, something that will mean something to Cleveland fans for years. And the story surrounding Shedeur Sanders already contains exactly that kind of material. A quarterback who entered the draft and was publicly disrespected in ways that were visible and documented, who arrived at a franchise structurally unprepared to develop him, and competed through 7 games under conditions that would have fractured a lot of young players, and earned Pro Bowl recognition doing it. Who spent his offseason doing invisible work in Miami and turned down camera time because he had something more important to focus on. Who showed up to voluntary minicamp, took the first reps in 11-on-11 team drills, and then watched the coverage declare the competition functionally over before training camp had even opened. That is the story. That is the foundation of something real and lasting. And what makes me genuinely angry, not frustrated, actually angry, is that the coverage isn't treating it that way. The third-string projection that circulated after those 3 days of minicamp is, without qualification, the single most analytically indefensible take this entire coverage cycle produced. That conclusion was built on the visual impression of 72 hours of spring work conducted with no pads, no competitive pressure, no evaluative conditions worth trusting. The head coach was on record. He said publicly that he had not named a starter. He said no competitive conclusions should be drawn from an April voluntary session. He confirmed that the rep distribution favored Shedeur overall. He confirmed Shedeur went first in team drills. That information was available to every reporter in that room. And certain voices still produced a confident third-string projection from the same evidence. That is not organic analysis growing from honest observation. That is a conclusion formed in advance, dressed in the language of reasoning after the fact. And the people consuming it deserved better. Cleveland is at a fork. Not a metaphorical one, a real, consequential fork with real stakes attached to every choice made between now and the moment a starter is named. On one side sits the familiar institutional path, honoring sunk cost, managing the competition around financial considerations, allowing $46 million to quietly shape an outcome that should be determined entirely by football merit. On the other side sits something rarer and harder, a genuine evaluation, conducted under real competitive conditions that lets the actual evidence determine what happens next, regardless of what that answer costs the organization in terms of justifying past decisions. The reporting wants you to believe this competition is already trending one direction. I'm telling you, the evidence doesn't support that conclusion. Not even close.